The Fire Festival, Chapter 29 of Shardik by Richard Adams. As dusk fell along the terraces of the Leopard Hill, with a green, yellow-streaked sky in the west, and flutterings of bats against the last light, the new moon, visible all afternoon, began to gleam more brightly, seeming, as it moved toward its early setting, so frail and slender as almost to be insubstantial, no more than a ripple of the surrounding air catching the light, like water undulating over a submerged rock. Small and lonely it looked, despite the nearby stars, fragile and fine as a greenfinch in spring, assailable as the innocence of a child wandering alone in a field of summer daisies. All below lay in silence and starlit darkness, the city quieter than midnight, every fire extinguished, every voice silent, not a light that gleamed, not a girl that sang, not a flame that burned, not a beggar that whined for alms. This was the hour of the quenching. The streets were deserted. The sandy squares, raked smooth at close of day, stood empty, ribbed and void as wind-frozen pools. Once the distant howl of a dog broke off short, as though quickly silenced. So still at last grew the moon-faint night that the sound of a boy's weeping, in the barracoon of the slave market, carried as far as the Peacock Gate, where a single guard stood in the shadows, his arms folded, his spear leaning against the wall at his back. Above this expectant quiet, still as the spring fields outside the city, the wan crescent of light moved slowly on, like one compelled to travel towards a dark destination, of which he knows only that it will end his youth and change his life beyond foreseeing. High on the serpent tower, Sheldra, cloaked against the night air, stood gazing westward, waiting for the lower horn of the declining moon to align itself with the pinnacle of the Bramba tower at the opposite corner. When at last it did so, the mile-wide silence was broken by her long, ululent cry of, "Shardik! Lord Shardik's fire!" A moment after, a streaking, dusky tongue of flame leapt up the 30 feet of pitch-coated pine trunk erected on the palace roof, appearing from the city below as a column of fire in the southern sky. From along the walls dividing the upper from the lower city, the priestess's wailing call was answered and repeated, as 5 similar but lesser flames rose, one after another, from the roofs of the equidistant guard turrets, like serpents from their baskets at the reedy note of the snake-charmer. Then, from the lower city, there followed, in appointed order, the flames of the various gates and towers, the Blue Gate, the Gate of Lilies, the towers of the great clocks, the Tower of Seldalad, the Tower of the Orphans, and the Tower of Leaves. Each flame soared into the night with the speed of a gymnast climbing a rope, and the poles burned in long blazing waves, the fire rippling like water along their sides. So for a little they stood alone, indicating the length and breadth of the city where it lay along the plain like a great raft moored under the steep of Crander. And as they burned, their crackling alone breaking the silence that returned upon the ceasing of the cries from the towers, the streets began to fill with growing numbers of people emerging from their doors, some merely standing like the sentry in the dark, others groping slowly but purposely toward the caravan market. Soon many were assembled there, all unspeaking, all standing patiently in a moonset, flame-flecked owl-light, almost too dim for any to recognize his neighbor. Then, far off against the Leopard Hill, appeared the flame of a single torch. Quickly it moved, bobbing, descending, racing down through the terraces towards the Barb, through the gardens and on towards the Peacock Gate, which stood ready open for the runner to enter the street of the armourers, and so come down to the market and the reverent waiting crowd. How many were gathered there? Hundreds, thousands. Very many men and some women also, each one the head of a household, justices and civic officers, foreign merchants, tally-keepers, builders and carpenters, the respectable widow side by side with Auntie from the Jolly Girl's house, hard-handed cobblers, harness-makers and weavers, the keepers of the itinerant labourers' hostels, the landlord of the Green Grove, the guardian of the Provincial Couriers' Hospice, and more, many more, stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, their only light the distant glinting of the tall flames which had summoned them from their homes, each carrying an unlit torch, to seek, as the gift of God, the blessing of the renewal of fire. The runner, a young officer of Gedladan's household, honoured with this task in recognition of a courageous service in Lipan, carried his torch, lit from the new fire on the palace roof, to the plinth of the great scales, and there at last halted, silent and smiling, waiting a few moments to collect himself and to be sure of his effect, before holding out the flame to the nearest suppliant, an old man wrapped in a patched green cloak and leaning on a staff. "Blessed be the fire!" called the officer, in a voice that carried across the square. "Blessed be Lord Shardik," replied the old man quaveringly, and as he spoke, lit his torch from the others. Now a handsome middle-aged woman stepped forward, carrying in one hand her torch, and in the other a yellow-painted wand, in token that she was deputizing for a husband absent at the war. There were many such in the crowd. "Blessed be the fire!" cried the young officer again, and "Blessed be Lord Shardik," she answered, looking him in the eye with a smile that said, "And blessed be you too, my fine fellow." Holding her lit torch aloft, she turned and set out for home, while a rough, heavily built man, dressed like a drover, took her place before the plinth. There was no jostling or haste, but a measured and joyous solemnity, as torch after torch was lit. None might speak until after the gift of fire had been bestowed upon him. Not all waited to receive the fire from the actual torch carried from the palace. Many, eager, took it as it was offered by those who were moving away across the square, until on all sides resounded the happy shouts of "Blessed be the fire!" and "Blessed be Lord Shardik!" Gradually the square became full of more and more points of light, like sparks spreading across the back of a hearth or the surface of a smouldering log. Soon the tossing, dancing flames were flowing out in every direction along the streets, while loosened tongues chattered like birds at first light, and the rekindled lamps began to shine in one window after another. Then, on the roofs of the houses up and down the city, smaller fires began to burn. Some were poles, in imitation of those already lit on the gates and towers, others braziers full of wood, or clearer fires of scented gums and incense-sprinkled charcoal. Feasting began, and music, drinking in the taverns, dancing in the squares. Everywhere the gift of light and warmth by night manifested the power over cold and darkness bestowed by God on man, and man alone. Beside the Barb, in the upper city above the Peacock Gate, another, graver messenger had arrived with his torch, none other than General Zelda, his full armour dully reflecting the smoky light as he strode toward the ripples lapping on the shore. Here, too, suppliants were waiting, but fewer and less fervent, their emotions modified by that detachment and self-conscious restraint which characterizes the aristocratic, wealthy, or powerful participating in popular customs. Zelda's invocatory "Blessed be the fire" was spoken indeed with raised voice, but in a formal, level tone, while the responding "Blessed be Lord Shardik," though uttered sincerely, lacked the hearty ring of flower girls or market porters in the lower city, breaking 2 hours' darkness and silence with words appointed to commence one of the great frolics of the year. Keldrek, robed in saffron and scarlet, and attended by the priestesses of Shardik, stood waiting on the highest terrace of the Leopard Hill, surveying the city below, the torches spreading through the streets like water flowing from a sluice along dry irrigation channels, the multitudinous shapes of doors and windows emerging in light out of the darkness, as though called into existence by the new fires kindled within them. And nearer, the lines of flames lengthening, extending further along the shore of the barb. So sometimes may news actually be seen to spread through a crowd, wind across a dusty plain, or sunrise down the western slope of a valley. About him burned the salts and gums and oils prepared for the fire festival, mysterious and splendid in combustion, kingfisher blue, cinnabar, violet, lemon, and frost-green beryl, each transparent, gauzy fire in its bronze bowl, carried upon rods between the shoulders of two women. The gong-like bells of the palace towers were ringing, their shuddering harmonies vibrating over the city, fading and returning like waves upon a shore. As he watched, the slip of the new moon sank at last below the western horizon, and upon the lake appeared the gliding shape of a great dragon, a grinning monster all of fire, green-eyed and clawed, its jaws spouting a plume of white smoke that trailed behind it as it gathered way. Shouts of admiration and excitement broke out, young men's battle cries, and the stylized calls of the chase. Then, as the dragon reached the center of the barb, there sprang into being upon the further shore another fiery shape, erect upon its hind legs, 30 feet tall, round-eared, long-muzzled, snarling, one clawed forepaw raised aloft. As the cries of "Shardik! Lord Shardik's fire!" rose higher and echoed from the walls about the garden, the figure of a naked man, bearing a torch in each hand, appeared in the bear's jaws. One moment he paused on that high, bright platform, then leapt out above the water. Secured to his shoulders, and unrolling behind him, was a long strip of tarred canvas, which, burning, made it appear as though the bear were salivating fire. The leaper, plunging into the water below, slipped out of his harness and swam to the shore. Another followed, and now it was the shape of a fiery arrow which fell from the bear's mouth to the water. Quicker and quicker came the leapers, so that the flaming shapes of swords, spears, and axes poured from between the bear's teeth to hurtle down over the lake. At length, as the dragon, belching smoke, glided beneath the towering effigy of Shardik, a burning noose dropped to encircle the prow forming its throat. The lights of its hot eyes went out, and amid shouts of triumph, its smoky breath died away as it floated captive at the glowing, ember-shaggy feet. Meanwhile, Kelderek and his train had already begun to descend the terraces in slow procession. The chanting of the priestesses rose about him with a sound that wrung his heart, for it was that same antiphony that he had first heard in the forests of western Ortelga. Then the voices of Ransay and the Tuginda had formed part of a wall of sound encircling a summit of the spirit, sublime above the mortal world of fear and ignorance. Yet of this memory his grave, lean face showed no outward sign. His clasped hands were untrembling, and his body, beneath the heavy robes, moved firmly on towards the appointed destination. The plant scents of the night, thin and evanescent in the early spring air, mingled with the resinous odors of the colored fires and the drift of torch smoke on the breeze, and, bemused perhaps by these and by his fast since sunrise, by his memories and the sound of the singing, he imagined first one and then another companion to be walking beside him towards the torch-lit garden and the dragon-reflecting lake. A dark girl, wearing a broad golden collar, who laughed and plunged the point of an arrow into her white arm before turning to him a face wan with fear. A tall, gaunt woman, limping exhausted on a staff, her sweating hands clutching a box where bladders lay packed in moss, and an old red-eyed hag, who tottered at his elbow in filthy rags, bearing in her arms a dead child, and imploring his help in mumbled words beyond his understanding. So real did they seem, that dread and foreboding came upon him, pacing on. "Shardik," he prayed, "Senendril, Lord Shardik, accept my life, redeem the world, and begin with me." And now he is come to the garden, where the lords and ladies fall back before him, and the barons raise their swords in salutation of the power entrusted by God to the priest-king. The priestess's singing dies away, the copper bells are silent, the fiery bear and the dragon have done their strife, and burn low, with none to regard. The people about the shore cease their shouts and cheering, so that the distant sound of the lower city's riot rises up from below the walls. The priest-king walks forward alone, before the eyes of armed barons, and of the envoys of his vassal provinces, towards the brink of a deep inshore pool, the pool of light. Here, unhelped by man or woman, he must divest himself of his heavy robes and crown, and stand naked, in the sharp night air, to thrust his feet into sandals of lead, placed ready for him on the verge. Below him, deep in the pool, there burns amidst the darkness and water a single light, a light enclosed in a hollow crystal sphere secured to a rock, fanned with air and emitting its heat and smoke through hidden vents. This is the fire of Fleethill, devised long ago for the worship of Cran, but now made part of the fire festival of Shardik. Down the flight of underwater steps the king will go, his feet weighted, to carry him to the floor of the pool, and thence release himself and rise through the water, bearing that miraculous globe of light. Already he has moved forward, feeling for each stone step with the ponderous feet, and slowly descending in a silence broken only by the water lapping about his knees, his loins, his neck. But hark! What dreadful sound is that, breaking the reverent hush of Ortelgan warriors and Becklin lords, slicing like a sword across the crowded garden and empty lake? Heads turn, voices break out. A moment's silence, and it is repeated, the roar of a great animal in rage, in fear and pain, so loud, so fierce and savage that women clutch the arms of their men, as at the sound of thunder or of fighting, and young boys feign unconcern, ill concealing their involuntary fear. The lady Sheldra, waiting close to the king at the water steps, turns about and stands tense, raising one hand to shield her eyes from the torchlight as she tries to see across the garden to the dark outline of the king's house beyond. The roaring ceases and is followed by heavy, vibrating thuds, as though some soft but massive object were striking against the wall of that cavernous, echoing place. Keldrek, who had already drawn breath to submerge and drop from the lowest step to the bed of the pool, gave an inarticulate cry and struggled to release himself from the weighted sandals. A moment more, and he drew the pins, pulled himself out of the water, and stood dripping on the paved verge. The murmurs about him grew louder, unfriendly, and fearful. What has happened? What is he about? To break off unlucky. An unlucky act. No good will come of it. Sacrilege! In the crowd nearby, a woman began to weep with quick, nervous whimperings of fear. Keldrek, paying them no heed, bent down, as though to dress himself again in the stiff, heavy vestments lying at his feet. In his haste his hands fumbled with the fastenings, the robe fell sideways, and, flinging it down, he began to push his way, naked as he was, through the group of priestesses about him. Sheldra put a hand on his arm. "My lord." "Get out of the way!" answered Keldrek, roughly flinging her off. "What is the matter, Keldrek?" said Zelda, coming forward and speaking low and quickly at his shoulder. "Don't be foolish, man. What are you about?" "Shardik! Shardik!" shouted Keldrek. "Follow me, for God's sake!" He ran, twigs and stones piercing his bare feet. Bleeding, his naked body shoved and forced its way between men in armor and shrieking, scandalized women, whose brooches and belt-buckles scratched his flesh. A man tried to bar his path, and he felled him with a blow of his fist, yelling again, "Shardik, get out of the way!" "Stop! Come back!" called Zelda, pursuing and trying to clutch him. "The bear's only frightened of the fire, Kilderic. It's the noise and smell of the smoke's upset it. Stop this blasphemy! Stop him!" he shouted to a group of officers a little way ahead. They stared irresolutely, and Kilderic broke through them, tripped and fell, got up again, and dashed forward, his wet body smeared from head to foot with dirt, blood, and the leafy fragments of the garden. Grotesque in appearance, as dirty and lost to dignity as some wretched butt of the barrack-room, stripped, pelted, and chased by his loutish comrades for their mean sport, he ran on, heedless of everything but the noise from the hall now close in front of him. As he reached that same terrace on which he had joined Zelda the day before, he stopped and turned to those following him. "The roof! The roof's on fire! Get up there and put it out!" "He's out of his mind," cried Zelda. "Kilderic, you fool! Don't you realize there's a fire burning on every roof in Bekla tonight? For heaven's sake! Not up there! Do you think I don't know? Where are the sentries? Get them up there! Send men round to search the far side!" Alone, he rushed through the south door, along the ambulatory, and into the hall. The place was dim, lit by no more than 5 or 6 torches fixed along the smoke-streaked walls. By the cage bars in the centre of the hall, Zilphi was sprawled face down, her head lying in a puddle of blood that oozed over the stones. From the roof above came sounds of crackling and burning, and something heavy shifted and slipped with a rending noise. A sudden spurt of flame came and went, and sparks floated down, dying as they fell. Shardik, swaying from side to side like a fir tree when woodmen rock it at the base to loosen the roots, was standing erect at the further end of the hall, beating with his huge paws on the closed gate, and roaring with rage and fear as the fire burned more strongly above him. In his back was a jagged gash as long as a man's forearm, and near him lay a bloody spear, which, evidently torn from one of the panoplies on the wall, must have fallen out of the wound as he rose on his hind legs. Before the bars, with his back to Kilderic, stood a man armed with a bow. This also he must have snatched from the wall, for from either end still dangled the broken leather thongs by which it had been fastened. A heavy-headed arrow lay on the string, and the man, no doubt unaccustomed to the weapon, was fumbling as he drew it. Kilderic, naked and unarmed as he was, rushed forward. The man, turning, dodged quickly, drew his dagger, and stabbed him in the left shoulder. The next moment Kilderic had flung himself upon him, biting, kicking, and clawing, and borne him to the ground. He did not feel whatever wounds he received, nor the pain in his thumbs as he pressed them, almost to breaking, into the man's throat, and beat the back of his head against the floor. He stank his teeth in him like a beast, released his hold an instant to batter him, then clutched him once more and tore him, as a savage guard-hound tears a robber whom he has caught in his master's house. When Zelda and those with him entered the hall, bearing the dead body of a sentry, and holding under guard Elaroth, Ban of Sarkid, and envoy of Lipan, whom they had overpowered in the act of climbing down from the roof, they found the king, covered from head to foot in blood and dirt, bleeding from 5 or 6 stab wounds, and weeping as he bent over the young priestess on the floor. The lacerated body beside him was that of Mallow, envoy of Cabin, who had actually been torn and battered to death at the king's bare hands.